All right. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank everyone for attending the last part of our three-part webinar series on really building a sound policy management process within your organization, and certainly not specific to one vertical market, as this can be in the financial, healthcare, or commercial sectors, really. Just to introduce a couple of our panelists today, I'm sure you're familiar with Shelley Coltnow of IntraVires Health Compliance Consultants. She's got quite a bit of experience, as a lawyer in the healthcare space, and really in providing compliance and consulting services. Shelley, really glad you could join us again today. And Shelley's counterpart, Dan Fisher, also a consultant who's a part of IntraVires Health Compliance Consultants. Dan has quite a bit of experience also working with Shelley, providing consulting work in the healthcare space. And Dan, we're glad that you could join us today as well. And that leaves me. I'm JP Servo, and I've been with Etactics now for more than 7 years, and have a lot of experience in helping develop a number of different SaaS-based solutions, particularly our K2 compliance application, which we've talked about throughout the webinar series. But enough of getting to know who the panelists are. Today's agenda, we're really gonna cover what those best practices are in the policy management process. But also talk about benchmarks, key performance indicators, and kind of provide a recap of our three-part webinar series and everything that we've covered up to date. So when we talk about best practices and performance indicators, which is obviously going to be the focus of today's webinar, Shelley, do you mind kind of starting us off by really defining what best practices are and how to really identify them in the policy and procedure management process?
So, JP, just to go back to defining a best practice, it's really the way, a methodology of doing things that works better than any other methodology. And to find out what a best practice is, folks can look to their own experience and identify those things they do that work well, and then compare them to objective standards that are being followed in other organizations, or to some of the things we've been saying in these webinar series. And when they do that comparison, then they create a benchmark. And that benchmark will be where they aim to have their processes functioning. And then over time, they can move that benchmark. They can move the needle further towards better performance through continuous performance improvement. And as far as indicators about how that's working, continuous performance improvement really is the way to do that, comparing your performance each time, possibly at the end of each meeting by a discussion about how did the meeting go, and we'll talk about that near the end of our webinar. They can create key performance indicators, and we've added some to this performance today, so that when folks get their copy of the slide presentation, they can take a look at those key performance indicators and see if they work for them. And then compare what's really happening to the key performance indicators to keep that process on track. I think too, when the people who own the process, so in this case, the policy coordinator and the policy committee, will solicit feedback from each other and from the organization. They might survey from time to time to see if others feel the process is in line with the stated goals and objectives. And then continually following the processes as established or as agreed to enhance their reliability. So the more reliable a process is, the more likely it will be successful. And then the organization can then depend on the process to be reliable and correct any little parts of it that aren't working as expected.
So Dan, when Shelley talks about benchmarks, can you kind of explain what a benchmark is in the policy management process, as well as how you can identify what those benchmarks are and then use them moving forward?
Well, sure. I think a good note to make about benchmarks is that they're temporary. They evolve, and so whenever you establish your indicators for how your policy process should go or what best practices you find, then those benchmarks can change over time as your policies change, your organization changes, or just best practices change. So when you really set your standards, then be aware then they are able to evolve and mature. When you establish these benchmarks, then it's a good way to measure your reliability. So that way you can continually see if you're working towards the goal that you set over and over again. And when a process is reliable, then you'll be able to measure it. So you can see how well it's working towards that goal. So a benchmark is a great way to do that.
So our first webinar really focused on creating a guiding policy to help memorialize the policy management process. How can an organization incorporate these elements into their guiding policy so that it becomes both repeatable but also functional?
Let's see, JP, would you mind forwarding that slide?
We aren't seeing the screen, JP. I think we have a little technical problem.
Shelley, I'm sorry?
Let's see, we're looking at the slide that says measuring performance against the benchmark.
Yeah, I think as you continue to click, you click through the presentation now.
Yeah,
So
we're stuck on this slide, I'm afraid.
Oh, there it goes.
Yeah, maybe stop clicking for a minute. Okay. All right.
There we go.
Establishing a guiding policy.
Yes, and thanks for your patience there with that clicking problem. We had spoken in the first webinar how important it is to have a policy that lays out all the steps of a reliable policy management process. So to recap on that, the guiding policy really has to contain components that do that. So it's going to explain the steps within the policy management process. It's going to create a roadmap for the process owners to follow. And then, as we both said, to make sure that that process is reliably followed. First, the policy coordinator, who we've mentioned is a designated person to lead this management process, and the policy team that will be created to support that person in the process. And it establishes a format items for the policy manual and the individual policies themselves so that they'll all be consistent within the process. We just glanced through a KPI chart which includes all the components originally listed. So once a guiding policy is developed, it's important to make sure that it bumps up against the checklist and the intent of the policy process so that all those components are in there. And essentially the guiding policy will work as the framework for the process.
So Shelley, another critical step in establishing the policy and procedure management process is designating a policy coordinator, right? Well, how can you determine, who the best candidate is to fill that position? And Shelley, I'm sorry, one of our attendees had mentioned that she was having a little trouble hearing you. If you could just speak a little louder.
Sure, I'm sorry for that. Hope you can hear better now. About the policy coordinator, it's important for that person to be able to coordinate the process. And there's two elements that feed into that. One is, do they have the skill set to do it? Are they able to do it within what they know how to do? And two, do they have the bandwidth to do it? A lot of organizations begin their policy process perhaps with someone who has other job duties and responsibilities. So to land the policy coordinator role on top of other job duties, there has to be some consideration for the person's ability to have the time to do this job well. The other thing is we recommend that the organization have recognition for this position in a couple different ways, in the person's job title or in their compensation under the various human resources requirements for doing that. When establishing this position, they should be involved. And then management should really endorse the whole process and recognize the effort that's going to be made by the policy coordinator, and especially because this person is going to be accountable to fulfill job instructions specific to that responsibility. So 2 KPIs for the policy coordinator. They would include, are they successful in the first 6 months in meeting the job instruction that was created for the role or the responsibility? And the second one would be, are they meeting the requirements or measures of their job instruction going forward? And that could really be combined with an annual job review that's already being performed by the organization.
So Dan, Shelley had mentioned before that assembling a team to really help support the policy coordinator is important, right? But can you kind of reiterate what that importance is, of having that team in place, and who you should consider to fill the various positions on that team?
Sure. Well, just like Shelley said with the policy coordinator, then the members have to be willing to participate and be invested in the policy process. And also, like she said, then management needs to be copacetic with those members to make sure that they have the time to serve, it won't distract from their regular jobs, and that they are able to serve in that capacity, as well as their normal job duties. So we realize those are challenges. A good point is that they don't need to be high-level personnel, so executives or senior directors don't necessarily need to be the ones to serve on the policy team. It can be process owners or employees who are more knowledgeable about a certain smaller area of the company, and it can be the subject matter experts, really, who are hands-on with the policy process and really know how it might work in their area. I think the main thing, though, is that the members want to participate. Putting them on a team is a good way to motivate them, and really building a team that works well together is a good way to build momentum behind that. A good indicator we came up with for the policy team is just that the membership is representative of the whole organization. It's to make sure that the team has a holistic view of the company, and whenever policies come through, then they can be subject matter experts and really give perspective from their area.
Shelley, you've mentioned before that the first duty of the policy team, is really to develop and adopt its charter, which can really serve as the backbone, especially when the policy team may need some inspiration. What parameters should be included in that charter so that the policy team is not only authorized but able to fulfill it?
Well, the charter is really like the Constitution for the committee. So it's important to put in there issues that pertain to membership on the team. So how are members going to be appointed and reappointed? What's going to be the term of their membership? And who's going to nominate members? Also, attendance requirements for the members. So many charters, for example, say that members must attend at least 3/4 of the meetings, either in person or by phone. Whether or not the organization will allow a member to send a substitute should be in there, and what terms and conditions would apply there. Also, whether a member needs to be replaced for some reason. For example, a person leaves the committee because their role or responsibility with the organization changes, then how do you replace that person and what's the process? The meeting requirements, such as how often, what time of day, where, and how the meeting will take place. Here, you could add whether or not telephone meetings would be acceptable, for example, or Skype meetings. If everyone's at different locations, that might be a nice option. Who's going to take minutes? How those minutes are going to be taken? And then basically, should anything change in the policy process, which is likely while you're going through continuous performance improvement, how do you amend the charter to accomplish adding or removing a provision that you've changed? And then it should also have a requirement for regular self-assessment by the policy team to make sure you're on track. And obviously, some of those earlier KPIs pertain to where you would record the results of that. The charter has also subject to some KPIs, and we put a couple of these in the slide presentation. I think the most important two are that we make sure the members attend as appropriate. It's easy in the beginning to make it very important priority, and as the team gets more established, you might see attendance dropping off. So you want to measure that to make sure that it stays vital, and also that the team self-assesses.
Now, Dan, how do you go about deciding, what the roles and expectations are, for the different members of the policy management team?
Sure. So throughout the webinar series, we've talked about two very important roles. That's an author and a sponsor. So I think setting expectations ahead of time, before the team meets and before your policy process really kicks off, is a great way to make sure that people know what role they might play. For instance, anyone in the organization might end up being an author. They could end up writing a policy or being asked to co-author a policy, while mainly senior executives or directors will be the sponsors. Then they are accountable to know their areas of the organization, support their authors, and review the policies that come up through them. So I think the expectation that anyone might be an author, but only a select few would be sponsors, is a good thing to set ahead of time. And with that, then just determining if anyone will be able to delegate their roles. So if an author can delegate their writing to a support staff member or a co-author, then that's a great facet to set ahead of time. So with that, we have a couple of performance indicators that you might want to consider for your dashboard. One is that the policies are submitted to the team with both a sponsor and an author listed. That indicates that the organization realizes what role people should serve and that there's a clear role for everybody that's involved in that policy. Also, that the policies are submitted before they expire. It means that the communication between the authors and the sponsors, and then the sponsors and the team, is strong, and that the process outside of the policy team meetings is going well.
Shelley, this one's for you, and I think a very important question, to really answer and take into consideration. But why is the review process so crucial to the success of an organization's ability to manage its policies? And what areas should really always be addressed during that review process?
Sure. So it's the policy team really makes sure that all of the elements of the guiding policy are met as policies flow through the process and come out the other side to be issued, because they are the rules of the road for the organization. So the team really serves the purpose of making sure that the policies are clear and that they're accurate. And those elements are reflected in essentially the guiding policy by the standards for formatting, for language, for how things are expressed, and the differences between a policy and a procedure, which we talked about in the second webinar. And also that they're accurate in the sense of processes going forward for those who have to follow them. If they're ambiguous or they contain unclear language, then they're not very effective, and your policy process will be less reliable. And then basically to understand that the policies have received review somewhere along the line through the sponsor perhaps or the author, to make sure that the policy is legally sufficient and it meets the terms and requirements for compliance for whatever it's pertaining to. And for KPIs, the policy committee would really be required to suggest any technical revisions that pertain to accuracy or clarity of the policy. And then to manage itself, along with self-assessment, it's going to perhaps have a KPI that the agenda is completed at each meeting. One trap for a policy team is that they will spend too much time on one policy, not enough time on others. And so is their throughput appropriate? Is the amount of time spent for each policy appropriate? And are they completing the agenda as they've planned it out ahead of time?
Dan, you could almost say that conducting a final check is almost really just taking a closer look at what the technicalities are in the policy management process. But how can you really make sure that even those technicalities are being followed?
Sure. So this is another call to action for the policy coordinator. After the team approves the policy and has suggested their revisions, and any revisions have been returned, then the policy coordinator really has the duty to look at it before it goes into the manual or it's distributed to all the employees or people that are going to follow it. So things that the policy coordinator checks for are considerations like, is the policy actually formatted properly? In other words, did the team's suggestions take hold? Has it been proofread? Is it dated? Another important consideration is if the policy they have in front of them about to go in the manual is the version that matches the one that the team approved, so that nothing got lost in translation or they didn't get the incorrect file, then that's important to make sure that what was approved is what goes out. And then, does it have all the necessary approvals? So did the sponsor acknowledge it? Did the team acknowledge it? And then did the author, in the long run, after they returned the policy or the team approved it, did the author say that they're happy with it as well since they wrote it? So those are some final checks for the coordinator to do before the policy is actually published. And that will make sure that the process is reliable and no one follows the wrong document.
So let's assume for a moment that I am a sponsor and a part of the policy management team. what is my role as a sponsor in the distribution process of a policy that has recently been published by the organization?
One of their main duties is that they follow the process that's in the guiding policy. The guiding policy doesn't just apply to the team, it applies to all the employees, authors, sponsors, and anyone involved in the policies themselves. So one thing a sponsor can do is coordinate with or communicate with the policy coordinator and with the team to make sure what they submitted, they get back with revisions if it's necessary. They get notice that the team has approved it, and that they really rely on that process. Since the sponsors are over these areas and they're really senior leaders, then they're accountable to make sure the process is working for them. It's also good to make sure that their employees, the authors, and anyone in the organization has some sort of line of communication to give feedback. Once a policy is published, then sponsors should be on alert that someone might call them with a question, they might have a concern about what's written, or they might actually give other feedback to an appropriate contact. And this will end up being communicated to the sponsor and the policy team. So it's sort of a call to action after something's been published, that there might be some further feedback loops, and sponsors are still on alert. Some KPIs that we thought of for this process, really for the sponsors, are in the coordinator, is that the coordinator has read receipts or attestations, some way of tracking when they send the policy out that people actually get it and open it. And that's a great indicator of success that the distribution process is taking hold. Also, to set some sort of turnaround time when people ask questions about a policy or have a concern, that someone on the team or the coordinator, the sponsor, returns an answer within a certain amount of time. That way, there is some corrective action needed or there is a revision needed, then the policy doesn't sit out there with some sort of error for too long, that they can take the feedback and correct it before it goes back out.
Now, Shelley, I'm sure that we could host an entire webinar or even series just on the importance of effective communication, and how a lack of that communication really hinders any organization, or business units. Now, when we talk about communication in the policy management process, what measures can be taken to really promote that continuous and effective communication?
Sure. So one of the very first methods is to, as Dan talked about, have a good distribution process so that when a new policy is issued, it becomes available and easily accessed by the organization, and especially by those who have to follow it. And we had talked earlier about the difference maybe between an SOP and a policy, a department policy, and a organizational policy. So the communication process is going to flow according to what level that policy is issued at, whether it's an organization-wide, whether it's department-wide, or whether it's a process SOP. But in any event, the authors and the management of the area impacted by the policy are responsible for conducting education and training for those who need it once the policy is approved and published. Remember that the policy committee is not responsible for the education, but only to assure that education has been conducted if it's needed. Sponsors are really the accountable level for making sure when the education has been completed and documenting that. And questions or concerns can be, if the author themselves aren't conducting the education, can be conducted back to the author to make sure that any concerns of the employees involved will be handled possibly through a feedback loop or an amendment loop. KPIs for this one are probably pretty well known to our listeners. How many employees governed by the policy have actually attended education and training sessions, which can be tracked with sign-in sheets, for example, and maintained in the department which is conducting the education. And obviously, it's important to communicate to employees how to access the policy manual and how to find the most recent version of the policy.
So one of the most successful coaches, of all time in the NFL, and really across all major professional sports, is Bill Belichick. Now, being from Northeast Ohio, we're not huge fans of Bill Belichick, but the one thing I've always respected was, throughout his coaching career, he's always had a motto that's been, do your job, meaning that every member of a team, whether it's a policy management team, a professional sports team, every person or member of that team has a specific job to do, right? In order to be successful, everyone needs to do their particular job, regardless of what it is. With that being said, Shelley, what are some of the consequences in the policy management process, when a contributor fails to do their job, and what measures can be taken within an organization to really make sure that everyone from the policy team members to even the workforce employees does their job appropriately?
Wow. Well, I love the idea of a sports coach here because you're right. Everybody does their job and the process becomes very reliable. And by that, we mean that it works every time and that folks, no matter whether they're doing a job that's impacted by a policy or whether they're drafting a policy or whether they're developing a new policy, is following the process. So some of the questions on this slide help to measure whether or not folks are doing their job. So we want to just touch on, is the policy process memorialized by the policy team in their minutes? The minutes are really the reflection of what the group is doing each time it meets, and so minutes should be kept and make sure that they're detailed enough to support an understanding that they're doing their job. The review dates, the policy meeting dates, and other key dates should be calendared. And the reason that's on there is very often when you have a standing meeting or you have an ongoing commitment, it's very easy to schedule over that time and say, well, I go to that meeting every week, I have a more important meeting. But really with any kind of process meeting like this, it's important for the members to attend and that their attendance is tracked, calendared, and there's an understanding that those meetings are standing meetings that have to be attended. And then making sure that the policy gets published properly, folks can see it, and that any questions or concerns are fed back to the authors and sponsors so that they can be managed within the process. And then finally, again, we've talked about it several times, making sure that we understand if we could have done anything better, because that's what the basis or the foundation of continuous performance improvement is. How can we do it better?
So everything that's been covered up to this point, leads to establishing both a repeatable and reliable process. But why is it so important for an organization to have that policy management process that they can truly rely on?
So, JP, I think one of the old adages that we follow a lot in healthcare, and I'm sure in other industries, is that variability is the source of errors. So the more reliable and repeatable the process is, the less likely it will be that something will go wrong. And to demonstrate that is an objective measure of how your organization takes this whole process seriously and puts time and effort into it. So accreditation, surveys, various audits and reviews will have findings that your policy process is reliable, and as such, then you will not have deficiencies that come from failures in this area. And then making sure that any external audits and reviews can easily access the policy, or in the case of liability, for example, that the proper policy at the proper time was followed, can be very important in defending an organization against a claim or concern like that. And then demonstrating compliance is another important thing that policies do. The more reliable your process is, the more detailed it is, and the more folks that understand it around the organization, the better for compliance purposes, especially if a government audit takes place.
So Shelley, let's say an organization has established that repeatable and reliable policy management process. Why should they be concerned with trying to find areas for continuous improvement? And what best practices can the organization implement then to promote continuous performance improvement?
Well, just like delivery of service to a customer or care to a patient, it's important for management to keep its own processes in a high reliability, high quality realm. So continuous performance improvement is one way to do that. And it makes sure that the most efficient and effective way of handling a process is followed. And we've mentioned before, and we'll mention now, the PDCA process, which is plan, do, check, act, which means that as we do our self-assessments, and maybe even at the end of every meeting, we look back and say, what could we have done better? We work that and any suggestions that come from it into the PDCA process. We lay out what could have been done better, how could we do it better. We try it that way, we check and make sure that it is better, and then we start the process over again. And by doing that, we continuously move our process towards a higher level of accuracy and reliability.
Well, we've covered quite a bit over the last 3 webinars, and there appears to be quite a few moving parts as well as contributors to the policy management process. So Dan, how can organizations, small or large, really begin to streamline this process and make life a little bit easier, when establishing a sound policy management process?
Well, I think the best 2 tips are to do research and use tools. So as Shelley talked about, then one of the keys to making something reliable is continuous performance improvement. And what we said about benchmarks is that they're temporary. So a best practice or a benchmark changes as you do more research or as times change. And so using tools and doing research is really a good strategy to make sure that you continually improve. So there are tools that can help you do that. And these include things like checklists that cover all your steps in the process, or make sure at your meetings that you go through everything you need to and meet your KPIs. Keeping minutes for those meetings where you can review them after the fact when someone has time, or make sure that everything made it in there that should. Using surveys and feedback from employees to make sure that they know how to find policies, how well your systems are working, what they think of them, if they're easy to follow, things like that that might damage the process or make it stand out. Technology solutions, as the ones you provide, that can help you stamp versions or facilitate distribution, or just make things more presentable. You can use independent audits and reviews of your policy management system to make sure objectively that someone can follow it and that it's pretty well controlled. As we've stressed, then teams can do self-assessments to make sure that they feel that when they contribute to the policy process, they're making a difference and that the team and the coordinator are working well together, and that sponsors really know what their areas are covering and how they're supposed to interact with the team. So self-assessments are a great way to do that. And then along with research, then they have different forums and journals and webinars and other educational resources that your company may subscribe to, or that you can find on the open internet or in a journal. And those are great to do some research and see how other people or other companies are working their policy management system.
So, Shelley, you've referenced how software is a great aid and resource to help facilitate some of those vital components that really fortify strong policy management. But as the principal consultant of IntraVires Health Compliance Consultants, you're the perfect person to really talk about how consulting is also an incredibly invaluable resource to help develop a successful policy management process. But what are the benefits of an organization can really enjoy, when you combine those two available resources?
Great question, JP. I think sometimes if an organization is really new at a process, planning to upgrade its process to a different level, or planning to automate its process, it's important that they cover a lot of ground. As you said, there's a lot of different moving parts. So putting together a good guiding policy is something that consultants can help with, as well as making sure that the process steps are touched on by all the tools that are going to be used, and maybe even suggest some different tools. One way that we like to bring our services forward is in helping to install good technology solutions that cover processes. And we talked a little bit in the last slide where a technology solution is really a tool that helps the process work well. In automating things like meeting dates, review dates, expiration dates, due dates, those kinds of things, and standardizing templates, technology solutions can take a lot of the hard work out of a really strong policy process and increase its effectiveness.
Well, thanks, Shelley, for sharing that. And to just kind of wrap things up, we started the beginning of our webinar series in April, and want to thank everyone who has attended, all three parts, to our series. And we've certainly, and talked about in the beginning that we wanted to build this sound policy pyramid and structure that, as a employee or a policy administrator at an organization, building a sound structure, will really not only just help the organization continue to grow, but also, you'll be able to leave that lasting impression on the organization, even if you've moved on to a greater opportunity within the organization, or to another opportunity outside of the organization. And we've covered these three steps and really focused on these three components to help everyone who's attended and established that sound policy management structure and process. Now, if anyone has any questions for us at this time, we certainly want to open it up to to the floor, to the audience. Now, I know we kind of briefly went through some of those KPI slides, and as mentioned, everyone is going to get a copy of the slide share, and our wonderful marketing guru here is going to just edit the recording, and again want to thank everyone for just being patient, as we experience a little technical difficulties. But again, want to thank everyone who attended, and our contact information will be listed here on this last slide. So if anyone has any questions about our K2 compliance technology and, or IntraVires Health Compliance Consultants, the consulting services that they provide, please feel free to reach out to either one of our organizations. Shelley, Dan, didn't know if you wanted to add anything.
Sure. Well, like we had said, I think in the first presentation, then one thing our company does that I think is helpful is that we really work across the healthcare spectrum. So if you're an FQHC or a small billing company, a hospital, an insurer, or a third party, a supply chain management company, then don't hesitate to call. Then, the policy process is really something that any company can put in place, and we're certainly willing to help with that. So don't feel left out by any means.
All right. We're not seeing any questions from the audience. So, and obviously, if you have any questions that you haven't addressed during the webinar question portion here, again, please feel free to reach out to myself, Shelley or Dan, to address any of those questions. And again, we appreciate everyone who attended today, and be on the lookout for the copy of the recording and the slide share. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.